Good afternoon, everyone. On behalf of the Gettysburg National Military Park, assisted by the Gettysburg Foundation, I'd like to welcome all of you once again to our midwinter program season. My name is Bert Barnett. I'm one of the rangers out here. Programs will continue after this one for a bit. We will have someone else in my stead tomorrow, and that's going to be Angie Atkinson, one of the other interpreters out here, and she's going to speak on Thomas Francis Meagher and his role and experiences out here during the war and what happened to him and some of the things that went on. But I would like to take the opportunity out here again to thank you all for coming out here. I know it's a little bit more of a drab day than we had yesterday, so perhaps a bit of a diversion for you here. And controversy is one of those things that we run across from time to time. And when folks will take the time to record their experiences, as I'm being recorded 7 ways from Sunday right now, the experiences that they record in years afterward, one tends to take in a serious way, and thus the title that we come to today. The Cannoneer, Story of a Private Soldier, Recollections of Service in the Army of the Potomac, published in 1890 in book form by the National Tribune Company of Washington, D.C. This was the way that many students became familiar with Augustus Caesar Buell. Now, what a name. I mean, you know, if somebody's going to be gifted with a title that's going to be on the title page of a book, what a name. Augustus Caesar Buell. And for years, this work was seen as the classic example of a frontline artillerist's diary in the Civil War. Packed with battery rosters, maps, powerful accounts of famous battles, bolstered by the corresponding testimonies of supporting witnesses, this was the detailed work, and it seemed to have it all until the story behind it was revealed. However, the very power of the work spawned a phenomenon that we know in a particular term. By the way, are there any attorneys present? Now, there's a particular reason that I asked that seriously. Don't be afraid to raise your hands. You're in warm company here. It's dark out there, I can't see, so somebody might have to confirm if there are or are not. But at any rate, the reason I ask that is because this was not all it was cracked up to be in the years when the truth about it was discovered. And of course, when it was discovered that this was not entirely a reliable work, there's a legal term that emanates from that called the fruit of the poisonous tree. And all of those folks who had dived into this and who had really found a marvelous series of stories that were tremendously well written found that this was a tremendous thing to draw from. In The Blue and the Gray, Henry Steele commentary, you get such things. No one now living will ever again see the 2 brigades of Wadsworth's division, Cutler's and the Iron Brigade, file by as they did that morning. The little creek made a depression into the road with a gentle ascent on either side, so that from our point of view, the column, as it came down one slope and up the other, had the effect of huge billows of men topped with a spray of shining steel, and the whole spectacle was calculated to give nerve to a man who had none before. What a tremendous display and discussion and description of the first day's battle as it was opening. Number 2, the guns at Gettysburg. First real good account of the Federal artillery and the Confederate artillery. Chapter 3, the first day of battle. The guns became very things of life, not implements but comrades. Every man was doing the work of 2 or 3. At our gun, the finish, there was only two or three. The corporal to number 1 and the number 3 with 2 drivers fetching ammunition. The water in Pat's bucket was like ink. His face and hands were smeared all over with burnt powder. The thumbstall of number 3 was burned to a crisp by the hot vent field. You can almost just feel the heat of the muzzle blast there. Example number 3. If we are whipped here and I pull through it alive, I'm going to make tracks for home, and the provost guard may be damned. Even not at Gettysburg. Chapter 16 in the Wilderness in Spotsylvania and Cold Harbor on the disposition of Parrott rifles. Now, Parrott rifles were the Saturday night specials of field artillery pieces. Cast iron with a reinforcing band at the rear to try and keep that hunk of cast iron from bursting altogether. One old regular gunner expressed the Army's opinion, if anything could justify desertion by a cannoneer, it would be assignment to a Parrott battery. Now, these, as you may have noticed, are relatively older books, but sometimes you can still get a fresh fish to bite at a dead worm in a hook that's been in the water for a while. Chapter 1, the fight along the Chambersburg Road. Up and down the line, the men reeling and falling, splinters flying from the wheels and axles where bullets hit. In rear, horses tearing and plunging, mad with wounds or terror, drivers yelling, shells bursting, shots shrieking overhead, howling about our ears or throwing up great clouds of dust where they struck, the musketry crashing on 3 sides of us, bullets hissing, humming and whistling everywhere, cannon roaring, all crash on crash and peal on peal, smoke, dust, splinters, blood, wreck, and carnage indescribable, but the brass guns of Old B still bellowed, and not a man or boy flinched or faltered. Every man's shirt soaked with sweat, and many of them sopped with blood from wounds not severe enough to make such bulldogs let go. Bareheaded, sleeves rolled up, faces blackened. Oh, if such a picture could be spread on canvas to the life. This is the gift of good writing. Part of what made Buell's work so compelling was the almost irresistible combination of its captivating storyline and its undeniable power. But it didn't start out as a book. It started out as a column in the National Tribune. What was destined to become the Cannoneer began as a series of 26 columns in the Tribune that ran between October of 1889 and April of 1890. In them, he introduces his service record with the 4th U.S. Regular Battery B. It began modestly enough on the 9th day of September 1862 and concludes on the 31st day of August 1865, when I was discharged from the service of the United States by reason of Special Order 191, Department of Texas at Brownsville. This detailed material only appears in the column. It did not appear in the book. Let's take a closer look at the author. Actually, it turns out that Augustus Caesar Buell was not a cannoneer at all. From Pfister's listing of New York troops, age 18 years, enlisted August 21, 1863 at Norwich, mustered in as a private in the 20th New York Cavalry, Company L, September 22nd, 1863, to serve 3 years, appointed corporal. November, date unknown, 1863, reduced in the ranks. April 30th, 1864, mustered out with company. July 31, 1865, near Manchester, Virginia. Now, if that image from the Cannoneer there is to be trusted, note the high boots, and for a cavalryman, the ever-present 1860 cavalry saber. As he was actually a post-Gettysburg cavalry soldier as well, his knowledge of artillery drill and many other details contained in his work was certainly acquired post-war. Company L, 20th New York Cavalry, served mostly in eastern Virginia and the Carolinas, most notably at Darbytown Road, the fall of Petersburg, and the Appomattox campaign, sustaining very light casualties. So he must have gotten his artillery information from somewhere else. In the post-war era, Buell had the luck to cross paths with a Battery B vet, Charles Henry Moore, who had served with the unit from 1856 to 1865. Charles Moore would die in 1896. He came to know Buell while working as a fitter in Cramp's shipyard in Philadelphia during the mid to late 1880s. Moore was most likely Buell's artillery tutor and the source of much of his information. But not all of it, for as every writer learns, as soon as your words see daylight, come the critics in droves. Shortly after the story of a cannoneer first appeared, Battery B veterans began on occasion to poke holes in his story. An example is given here from October 24th, 1889. Note this rebuttal from Battery B artillerist John W. Knight, raising some legitimate questions. And you'll see here, I should also like the writer to explain how he managed to do without the number 4, as he was the most essential man in action, as he pulled a lanyard. And then he goes on to say, being on the right, and number 3 on the left of the gun. Now, anybody here familiar with field artillery of that era, you know that the number 4 is on the left, the number 3 is on the right behind the number 1. Now, one thing that fascinates me, below this in the column, the editor would say, we are obliged to Comrade Knight for the above correction. If he will read the sketch carefully, he will see the author states the roll is not accurate, but for the best he can do from memory. We would further be obliged to Comrade Knight, and here he kind of turns it. The editor and the author are apparently very much aligned together. We would be obliged to Comrade Knight if he would give us, as nearly as he can, the dates when the men he mentions joined the battery, how long they remained, whether they were detached volunteers or regulars, and what became of them. Our reasons for asking is that towards the end of the sketch there will appear a general roster and accounting roll of all the men who were in the battery from the beginning to the end of the war, and such information will be valuable in correcting that roll. Because obviously Buell has no idea of who these people were, and he's dependent on all of those fine people out there who actually were associated with the battery. Even in the later bound version of the Cannoneer, Buell seemed to have trouble with this detail. We're going to show you here an illustration from the bound volume, and you will notice that there's a shortage of folks around the gun as far as the 3 and the 4, and the gunner here standing. And also another little story about that as well. Comrade Knight must have made a slip of the pen, says the editor, saying that the number 4 is on the right and number 3 is on the left. Their positions are exactly the reverse of that. And the editor will go on to say, see page 77, revised manual, clause 106. And they're exactly right. I looked that up and was fascinated to see they were dead on the mark with that. Now, who keeps a nearly 30-year-old artillery manual about just to be able to reference that sort of thing? Certainly not an old ex-artilleryman. Somebody with a little bit of a higher steep in that. Now, of course, this National Tribune magazine, or newspaper as we're very much aware, was read by tremendous numbers of Union veterans as their memory piece, their memory newspaper of the war, and it would occasionally get other folks interested in what's going on with this as well. Captain Stewart even helps with this in a letter to the paper, November the 21st, 1889, in an article entitled, "The Old Man Comes to the Front." Stewart, in response to a letter written to him by Buell, responds. Firstly, there's a question in the letter by Buell directly to the captain. Your request to obtain photographs of Lieutenant Davidson, Mitchell, and Goodman received. I am sorry to say it is out of my power, as Mitchell and Goodman are dead. I have no idea where any of their friends are. But then he goes and writes generally here, Captain Stewart would, the sketch you are publishing brings back to my mind very vividly the incidents mentioned, and I certainly endorse most everything that the writer has said, with the exception of that concerning myself. He was a fairly humble fellow. The men were the best class of men that I ever saw in the military service, both for intelligence and military pride, and I certainly concur with the writer's statement as regards the bravery of the men while in battle. 2 lines above the highlighted portion here, you will notice Stewart writes, but I feel sure you could obtain the accurate rolls of the battery at any time you may desire by sending to the Adjutant General. This is a very worthwhile thought, but one Buell never takes up, because when Buell writes both the articles in the paper and afterwards the book derived from that, there will be repetitive phonetic spelling errors about various names in who was who in the accounting. And so the question becomes, why is Captain Stewart playing along with this? Does he just want to get the story out about what his guys did, or does he honestly not recall that Buell is not a member, which is a very interesting thing, because before he became an officer of this battery, he was the first sergeant for the battery and had a really good knack of being able to route off just from the back of his head every name of every soldier in the battery. And with that, you would figure that he would remember that Buell was not a name that he was familiar with. So much for the story of that particular portion of it. I want to move into how the battery distinguishes itself at Gettysburg and the recollection of it through Buell's book at this point. Now, how many folks have been out to the spot on the first day's battlefield since they have restored the Thompson House? Pretty neat, is it not? And they thought that they have decided to highlight that by taking the spot where the building used to be and actually putting the guns back in place along the battery monument. And it's a really neat view at that point to stand where those buildings were, look behind them, and get an appreciation of that. When you do that with the story that Buell has, or a section of that, I'm going to give a few edited sections of that, you get a sense of all of that. In Buell's writings on the first day here, a section of them at any rate, he will say, directly in our front, that is to say on both sides of the pike, and of course there's the Chambersburg pike there, on both sides of the pike, the rebel infantry whose left lapped the north side of the pike quite up to the line of the railroad grading, which would be right there, had been forced to halt and lie down by the tornado of canister that we had given them from the moment they came in sight and over the bank of the creek. But the regiments in the field to their right, and goes on to say, at this moment, Davidson, Lieutenant Davidson, commanding the section on this side here, bleeding from 2 desperate wounds and so weak that one of the men had to hold him on his feet, one ankle being totally shattered by a bullet, ordered us to form the half battery action left by wheeling on the left gun as a pivot, so to bring the half battery on line with the Cashtown Road, turning the guns facing to the south. Muzzles facing south, his object being to rake the front of the rebel line closing in on us from that side. Ordnance Sergeant Mitchell jumped on our off wheel to help us. "This is tough work, boys," he shouted as we wheeled the gun around, "but we are good for it." Now remember, this is all created. He is not there at all. He's not even enlisted in the service yet. And Pat Wallace, tugging at the near wheel, shouted back, If we ain't, where'll you find them that is?" Well, this change of front gave us a clean rake along the rebel line and for a whole brigade length, but it exposed our right flank to the raking volleys of the infantry near the pike, who at that moment began to get up again and come on. They gave us volley after volley in front and flank, and we gave them double canister as fast as we could load. The 6th Wisconsin and 11th Pennsylvania men crawled up over the bank of the cut or behind the rail fence in rear of Stewart's caissons and joined their musketry to our canister, while from the north side of the cut flashed the chain lightning of the old man's half battery in one solid streak. So he's describing all of this. Now, when these writing and descriptions would appear in the paper before the book account came, of course, there would be letters, both con and pro on occasion, about the descriptions of these activities. One of those would be from Rufus Dawes. On December the 5th, 1889, Dawes, former commander of the 6th Wisconsin Infantry, wrote, "I want to thank you for putting on record the fact that I formed a line of battle across the street in Gettysburg. This line was the cover of your retreat. We had a hot skirmish right there, but we held the street." Now, as the battery eventually would begin to move back closer to town, there would be a little bit of a difference between opinion and memory as far as that went. And Dawes would note this. He said, "My official report says 4 guns of Stewart's battery were in the timber on the right of the railroad cut. You say 3, and it is likely you were correct, although my report was written on July 17, 1863. I was ordered to support the battery, and until your statement, I had it in mind that 4 guns only were there. Dennis M. Fuller worked the number 2 gun, and I got a letter since your publication saying that that gun was on the Cashtown Turnpike." Now, he is technically correct, because 2 of the guns of Stewart's battery were hit by shots which cracked the trails of their guns. So at that moment, there were only 4 functional pieces. So he is correct. And again, this is the thing when you write a book about something you were not actually at, or write an account of that you were not actually at, the details of those little bits of truth are going to slip through the strainer there. But this is one of those little bits of that. Now, another thing that historians will take a little more umbrage at than that is when he slips into first person at this point, as he will do. Now, you'll notice here, and I'm sorry about missing that one slide, when the fight gets hot, as it does at this point, Buell will decide to throw himself fully into the matrix here. Now, when this desperate work began, I had stood close to the gun and thumbing the vent, standing bolt upright according to the letter of the manual. Now, when you're the number 3 and you are thumbing the vent, you're supposed to do this. And I struggled to get them to bring me an artillery piece in here, but they wouldn't do that. Presuming that you're working with the barrel right here, and let's say, just for convenience sake, that this is the vent, you're supposed to be right here so that the crook in your arm gives a little bit of a window for the gunner who is hanging the sight on the breech of the gun here, so that he can still continue to see through that, so that he can go from the rear sight to the front sight and continue to aim the piece. That's the way that's supposed to work. Notice the difference between that and the drawing there with the fellow sticking his thumb, like, you know, pulling out a plum thumb like that. There's a difference in there. Now, bear that little thought in mind here for a moment. About our 3rd load, a bullet from the enemy behind the fence on our flank tore through the breast of my jacket, making the cloth fly and carrying away the 2nd button from the top. My friend Packard, who had his hands on the screw at that moment in the act of letting the muzzle down a little, noticed this and called out, "Stretch out your arm, cub, and get cover of the wheel," like you see in the drawing right there. The wheel of a 12-pounder Napoleon with its deep felloes and huge spokes affords considerable cover for the number 3 against either a flank fire or a fire and sharp from infantry. My breast had a red welt across it and was sore for several days. Now, that may be the convenient thing to do, but if you're doing that, your fist is very much blocking the sight position for the gunner who needs to accurately aim the piece at that point. So it may be a cute story, but it deprives the gunner of being able to accurately aim the gun that you're supposed to be serving at that point. And the whole purpose of drill, how many vets I got in here? What is the purpose of repetitive drill? To get it right, and to get it right under fire and keep it right under fire. So that's a really cutesy story, and it don't work. Yeah. Now, you get a few little stories like that in there, and the readership is going to get curious, as indeed it will do. November the 21st, 1889. There appeared to be evidence that some battery veterans suspected a ghost rider. The upper little slice you see there comes from George W. New, And I think the author was or is a Western man or boy. I was with him at Gettysburg. He sends the editor a little letter. I would like his address now so as to write to him, not only as a comrade in revive old associations, but for a suggestion or two. And the editor sends back the lower block. It is our intention to let this sketch go to the public on its historical merits alone, independent of the identity of the author, though several veterans of the battery have already traced out the authorship to their own satisfaction from internal evidences familiar to them. Translation, we don't care who's writing this stuff. We're just going to keep pumping it out because we think it's a great story. We never let facts stand in the way of a good story. And when it goes time, at the end of the press run of this in the National Tribune, and turn it into a book, you're going to see some very interesting things inside the book. Now, this on the left here is a letter that is sent to the editor when the thing is running in the paper. And there's a comment there about Colonel Carroll. And the quote here on Colonel Carroll and what the comments that the author, what Buell makes about Colonel Carroll in his column. And he says, he knows what he was talking about, gives us straight goods. I am glad General Carroll gets credit for what he did. I think General Carroll was the most abused man in the Army. But when there was any quick and bloody fighting to be done, Carroll and his regiments were called on to do it. The boys used to call him Old Bricktop on account of his red head. Now, if you notice here, this is a copy of that section enclosed in the text of the book. So it's very interesting to see how he would just, to pad his book, he's not shy about taking letters from the newspaper and putting them right smack in there. Every author has to have a minimum page limit, so you put that right in there. I thought that was rather interesting. Same sort of thing when you want to have illustrations, and every book has to have some illustrations in it. So when veterans would begin to send them in there as well, and this would be one of those. But again, of all the people around the gun here, you will see Charlie Harris, Charlie Jenkins, Billy Castor, John Connors, and Jack Kennedy. You will not see Buell in there for obvious reasons. Now, don't get too down on all of this because, of course, Buell is not the only fellow, even from the Gettysburg battlefield, who will have a Gettysburg book or a Gettysburg section that does not specifically relate to Gettysburg, was not here at the time. Theodore Garish will write his Gettysburg experience from a hospital or his memories of Gettysburg post afterwards. Theodore Garish wrote A Private's Reminiscences of the Civil War in 1883, though he was absent from the 20th Maine, sick in U.S. General Hospital on the 9th of June and didn't return until September. Though he didn't state he was there, he didn't announce his absence either. Actually, I apologize, in this particular slide, Colonel Chamberlain looks a lot more ill than Garish does. But in the passage for Gettysburg, Garish writes, "How can I describe the scene? Imagine, if you can, 9 small companies of infantry put there to hold the key of the entire position of at least 10 times their number. The conflict opens. I know not who gave the first fire or who received the first lead. I wish that I could picture with my pen the awful details of that hour. How rapidly the cartridges were torn away from the boxes and stuffed into the smoking muzzles of the guns, how the steel rammers clashed and clanged in the heated barrels, how the men's hands and faces grew grim and black. A terrible medley of cries, shouts, cheers, groans, prayers, curses, bursting shells, whizzing rifle bullets, and clanging steel. And if that were all, my heart would not be so sad and heavy as I write." He doesn't say anything about not being there. 14 years later, in 1897, Colonel Joshua Chamberlain asked a trusted Gettysburg veteran of the 20th, Albert Fernald of Company K, to double-check Gerrish's Little Round Top participation. Fernald confirmed that Gerrish had not been present at Gettysburg, yet curiously, his name appears on the roster of Company H on page 268 of Maine at Gettysburg as submitted by Chamberlain. So, not the only mystery at that point. But that's not going to be the only mystery we have, because Buell found writing to be a drug in a serious way, because the second load of Buell is just around the corner. Paul Jones, founder of the American Navy. This will appear in 1900, and this will make waves for many years. Initially heralded as a great body of research, Buell's work left its landmarks along the way. Anybody ever been up to Portsmouth, New Hampshire? Anybody ever seen the John Paul Jones house up there? Okay, John Paul Jones did live in this house for a time during the mid and latter 1770s. Now, in Buell's work, there's a story there that says a group of Portsmouth women, led by one recently married Helen Seavey, tore up their finest gowns to patch together an American flag for Jones's use during the Revolutionary War, because he needed to have that as he harassed British shipping off the coast of Europe while captain of the Ranger, the ship he commanded at that time. But it never happened. The story was Buell's invention. Yet to this day, there is a historical plaque partially based on Buell's imaginative research and the Jones legacy. Later, Buell's fantastic quilting party story quite possibly saved this house when it was up for destruction. Helen Seavey, like so much else, was a fiction of Buell's imagination. Now, this will only be a part of this story. John Paul Jones will surface in 1905. And when it does, this will be a portion of a nest that Buell will find himself in. The Mrs. de Koven that you see in the clipping here is a rich socialite. And rich socialites have to have something to do in the turn of the century era. And she is, as it says here, writing a book about him, and she has been writing that book for some years at that particular point in time. And she and he are actually kind of competitors as far as that goes. When the two actually begin to parallel stream their stories about this, they will kind of lock horns. Miss Anna de Koven is kind of in the middle of idol worship of John Paul Jones. Paul Jones is Miss de Koven's hero. She cares a good deal that the things said about him should be correct and genuine. She has a lot of time, a lot of money to do this, because Mr. de Koven is a very highly thought of, very successful composer in this era, so she has the ability to do this sort of thing. And she had earlier criticized Buell when his book comes out. And there will be an article that appears in the New York Times on the 10th of June, 1906, that really goes after the book that Buell had produced. Based on bare threads of truth, say Miss de Koven, after many months of critical investigation, it is padded with inventions of clever construction and is of unparalleled audacity. And again, this is the New York Times article, June the 10th, 1906. She's not the only one who attacks Buell's work at this point. Samuel Eliot Morison, a name that some of you may be familiar with, was an American historian noted for his works on maritime history. And his works are seen as widely authoritative and highly popular. Among his historical works, Morison wrote John Paul Jones, a sailor's biography, and completes this in 1959, and it will win him his second Pulitzer Prize. Initially, He vowed to overturn every one of Buell's lies, but found the task so overwhelming he gave up and merely proceeded with his own research. Of Buell's work, he would write, quote, "He found it easier to write Jones's letters himself than to use the genuine ones in the Library of Congress, which he never visited." As a result of his prodigious myth-making in this area, Buell, not Jones, is now thought to be the literal originator of the famous quote, "I have not yet begun to fight." Another highly esteemed piece of writing associated with Jones for many years, Qualifications of a Naval Officer. And if anybody's here has been a naval officer, you may be familiar with that piece of writing. Bears the questionable stamp compiled by Augustus C. Buell from letters written by John Paul Jones, is widely seen reproduced in many places, even appearing still in naval circles. Now, by the way, I checked this morning's website at usna.org, and this is what was on there today. And if you'll notice the ominous last line right here, compiled by Augustus C. Buell from letters written by John Paul Jones. So his ghost still exists in that quarter. But we're not done yet. The final load of Buell is a balsa wood old hickory. History of Andrew Jackson, pioneer, patriot, soldier, politician, president. This will be published the year that Buell dies. By the time of Robert Remini's 1977 scholarly study of Jackson, one scholar noted of Buell's work in this area, there is a strong probability that what cannot be documented in Buell's work from other sources is either legendary, garbled, or fiction. Another Jackson biography was suspicious of Buell as a source, yet cited him 32 times. Even Remini, with hesitation, does likewise, citing a story that, quote, Aunt Betty Jackson, upon seeing the 5-year-old crying, commanded, "Stop that, Andrew. Don't let me see you cry again. Girls were made to cry, not boys." "Well then, mother," the young Andrew is supposed to have replied, "what are boys made for?" "To fight," she snapped. So you begin to get a sense that he just does like to tell stories. And this is one of the things that I kind of want to take into point here, because I talked to a few writers here, or tried to. One of them I'll tell you about, one of them I'll kind of make a glancing blow here. Michael and Jeff Shara, of course, are famous for historical fiction. And one of them, obviously, I was able to talk to. The other is very well known around here for the Killer Angels. But Jeff Shara said this: "Certainly anyone writing fiction should be honest about it. The risk, as has sometimes happened with my books, is that someone will quote a line of my dialogue as though it is fact when it is a product of my own imagination. Though I try painstakingly to be true to the characters, to put words in their mouths that ring true, at the end of the day, it's still fiction. As you know, neither my father nor I have ever tried to pass off our work as the facts. When I begin to hear that my books and his were being used in schools to teach history, that only added to the responsibility I feel to get it right. The critique of our work as being, quote, bogus history, unquote, as the astounding amount of nitpicking over the facts becomes patently ridiculous. Some historians feel that they have to set the record straight, as though by offering a work of fiction, we're somehow trespassing onto their private domain. So in other words, if done well, historical fiction can become a gateway drug of sorts, promoting some folks to become interested in academic history. And this is an interesting line to think about, because remember, this was regarded as truth until the cap came off of it. Now, years back, when another well-known, tremendously well-known book came out, it was regarded as strictly nothing but fiction. And I've got a letter by Margaret Mitchell here to a woman by the name of Lola discussing a few factual elements of her fictional novel. She actually did a great deal of research on this. December 1, 1935. About the war and Reconstruction women writers we were talking about. I have clawed my memory into some activity, and I think one book was The Wartime of a Georgia Girl by Eliza Francis Andrews. Another was A Woman's Wartime Journal by Dolly Sumner Lunt, Mrs. Thomas Berger. Another was Life in Dixie During the War by Mary Gay. I have read so much of this period during the last year that I cannot exactly remember whether these writers lived in Fulton or DeKalb counties or in more distant places. Mitchell, like the Sharas, engaged a historical setting to spin a false story, yet they never claimed their constructions were intended to be taken as true history. Given the setting of the times, however, sometimes circumstances fall beyond an author's control. Considering the strange death of Ashley Wilkes, the merging of history, fate, and fiction can, on rare occasions, under controlled circumstances, provide a limited benefit, as in 1943, as you see here with the obituary of Leslie Howard, famed British stage and film actor, and how it was announced. Because history helped tragedy turn fiction to reality, in the case of The Man Who Never Was. This was done for an extremely specific purpose. Acting Major William Martin, the man who never was created from an available corpse in Operation Mincemeat and intended to mislead the Axis powers prior to the Allied invasion of Sicily. Leslie Howard's legitimate loss was announced at the same time, thus granting more credence to the Major Martin story. But you've got to be careful, because this kind of fictionalization can be dangerous. Everybody remember what we would call alternative history? We've all been made familiar with it. Innocently applied, alternative facts are generously distorted personal perceptions, but at worst, intentional deceptions. They are the breeding grounds of pseudo-history. George Orwell made an interesting comment on the power of the written word. He who controls the past controls the future. He who controls the present controls the past. Now this, on one level, is surely a comment on power, but also an argument for responsibility by those who claim to write in the historical field. For who has more power years removed from an event than a gifted writer claiming some personal association with it? For many historians, crucial differences exist between accurate histories of past events and those malfeased manuscripts laden with historical inaccuracies. Failure to make these critical distinctions will affect our present understanding. As Mark Twain said it best, when I was younger, I could remember anything, whether it had happened or not. In 2002, a paper entitled The Function of the Historian in Society, Dr. Richard C. Carrier wrote, "As soon as our understanding of the past is divorced from facts and objectivity-fostering methods, all opinions become equal, and there will be no benefit from any one history, because there will be others that will wash out and cancel the effects of the one anyone may favor. As such a scenario develops, pseudo-historians wedded to a false past may become willing to resort to the use of force and intimidation to control the public mind, which essentially is the defining feature of a dark age. Then society will not flourish but stagnate and devour itself, breaking into divided units set against each other as people rally around that version of a pseudo-history that pleases them most." A version of history is what brings us here today in the Cannoneer. Over the years, some have liked it and some not. Dr. Robertson made the observation the most horrible embodiment of these sins is Buell's The Cannoneer. That appeared in his War and Words column back in 1977. And what he would quote would be a section of an article that appeared in the Pennsylvania Magazine of History and Biography in 1956. In an 11-page article in the 1956 issue, a work by Dr. Milton W. Hamilton observed, with a facile pen, a convincing narrative power which make his books good reading and popular, and a skill and anecdote greatly to be admired in a writer of fiction, he has perpetrated myths and inventions to the point where it often requires considerable research to disprove oft-cited episodes. Now, one of the sculptures at the base of the Soldiers' National Monument is Cleo, the muse, the one with the pad that she's writing everything she sees and recording it. But you have to carefully court her. Although on occasion a temptress, Cleo is a vain and wrathful mistress, and will stand only so much deception before turning upon a fraudulent suitor such as Buell. In his essay, Dr. Carrier also warned a society gripped by a pseudo-history is a victim of a social psychosis. It will suffer a memory disorder that, as with an individual whose memory is wholly fictional, will lead that society to confusion, despair, and self-defeating behavior. Yes, Buell was no historian, but he was a great writer. Now, Dr. Hamilton continues, it hardly seems necessary to investigate all the hallucinations of a dreamer for possible fact in the modern era, in the modern acceptable sense. But to continue and find what he had done through all of his works is something that needs to be done. Some task is imposed upon the historian as a result of his sheer literary output. Buell wrote 6 historical books in his career, not including his serial articles and a short post-war diary of what his travels were in 1867 and 1868. The Cannoneer, of course, is one. The Paul Jones that we've mentioned. The biography of Sir William Johnson. William Penn is the founder of 2 Commonwealths. The Andrew Jackson book that we referenced. And the memoirs of Charles H. Cramp, his employer in the shipyard in the 1880s. Given the fraudulences that we've seen in the works discussed above, Dr. Hamilton pleads this point. Since destruction of books will not down untruth, should it not be wise to have some of these works, in this particular case the Cannoneer, branded Cave Mendacem, beware of evil. Spot the Ranger. Because it is a temptation to throw yourself into anything attractively historian-oriented, as Buell did. That seems to be a rather cataclysmic condemnation to lay at the feet of one man for the moment in Buell's case. But in his case, Buell's research, especially in the case of the Cannoneer, stood veteran, mostly it stood veteran peer review. Irrespective of the crimson caveat, well, you know he wasn't there, his work yet continues to be referenced. Of course, his first-person elements in the text do work strongly against him, and for those deceptions he should rightly be held to account. In the case of the Cannoneer, Buell's use and abuse of sources, both primary and diffuse, blessed by an undeniable writer's gift, enabled him to create an unabashedly absorbing tale. We know Buell was not a participant in the major battles he chronicles. Neither was he an academic historian. But something in the essence of the grand story drew him, as I suspect it draws us all. His conclusion to the Battle of Gettysburg section in the Cannoneer is as honest a piece of writing as one may encounter. And this is his words here. These are his words. Yonder in the future, when all of us shall have passed away, and our descendants shall pride themselves on our deeds, as we now pride ourselves on the deeds of our revolutionary grandsires, the proudest of all boasts will be, my grandfather was a soldier at Gettysburg. By the time Civil War veteran and author Augustus Caesar Buell finally laid down his crooked pen on the 23rd of May, 1904, at the age of 57, he had blazed a trail of falsehoods across several historical eras. Notice here the benighted title of colonel in that illustration. Dubbed the father of lies by naval researcher Samuel Eliot Morison, his works remain controversial. For students of the American Civil War, and in particular of the Battle of Gettysburg, his initial work, The Cannoneer, will always remain his crowning, much debated creation. Good afternoon.